All right, let's go ahead and get into the Richard Wolff story. So I'm going to go ahead and add this here. So Richard Wolff had an interview recently. This was on Tom Hartman's show. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he was interviewing Richard Wolff about the Deutsche, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Deutsche Bank forecast for the U.S. recession. And this applies to this year. And this is why I wanted to talk about this, because I know it is only April, but you need to know about this now. You need to know what Richard Wolff is saying is going to happen. So listen to this, pay very close attention to this discussion. Let me go ahead and start this here. Move this to the second screen.
First of all, if you want to give us a little bit of a summary of why the Fed tries to deal with inflation by raising interest rates and what the consequences of that are, and how you think this is going to play out here.
Okay, well, the basic economics of this, very old, comes at least out of the 1930s, if not sooner. And the basic idea is if you have an inflation, prices rising, it's because employers figure they can get that money out of us. We'll pay more for the food, clothing, shelter, and so on. And so one way for the government to try to deal with it, if it's spinning out of control, as it is now, is to make us have less money. And how does the government do that? Raising interest rates. And the idea is, if you can't borrow from the government the way you used to, because you have to pay higher interest rates, if you're a bank or if you're an institution that deals with the government, if you have to pay the government higher interest rates, you in turn will charge higher interest rates to the individuals and the businesses that come to you. And in short, that will dissuade them. It's a kind of a disincentive to borrow, and that means less will be borrowed, therefore less will be spent, and therefore people thinking about raising prices won't do it, or won't do it as much, because they're becoming aware that people and businesses just don't have the borrowed money they used to have because interests have been raised. There are a lot of problems with this. It cannot work. It has in the past failed as often as it has succeeded, but that's the standard idea of why the government, and in this case the Federal Reserve, is raising interest rates.
So it seems like a blunt instance.
Did you notice he mentioned something that people don't tend to talk about much, and that is the Federal Reserve? And this is one of the things that I like about Richard Wolff, because oftentimes you'll hear people discuss the millionaires, the billionaires, but they tend to be pretty quiet when it comes to the banks. And that's really who you should be looking at. If you look at people like Elon Musk, if you look at people like Bill Gates, if you look at people like Mark Zuckerberg, they're just players in the game. They're just puppets. They are very minuscule when you compare them to the banks. And that's important for people to really understand. I want people to see the full scope of this. It's very easy to point fingers at those people. And don't get me wrong, they have their issues. I think they're very greedy, and I think they have too much money. But that's just my take on it. They have their issues. There are concerns that you should have with them. But the amount of money that they have is nothing compared to the banks. It's nothing compared to, we need to talk about the trillionaires. You notice you don't hear people talk about that. They usually stop right there. And Bernie Sanders did this as well when he was running in 2020. He'd usually stop right there at Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Walmart, Amazon. But the people or the corporations you really need to be calling out is Goldman Sachs. It's Wells Fargo. You need to call out those corporations. That's where the money is really at. And so he's mentioning the Federal Reserve. You know, we've had people, excuse me, I got a hiccup. Okay, it's gone. We've had people come on that have talked about MMT, modern monetary theory, on this show. And they've told you multiple times, listen, the United States government can mint a coin and get rid of all of this. You wouldn't have to worry about the student loans. You wouldn't have to worry about the medical debt. You could give everybody universal health care. So there are different ways that these economic problems in our country can be solved. Now, Richard Wolff has a little bit of a different opinion when it comes to MMT. I'm actually trying to see if I can get him to come back on again to give his opinion about that. But I like the fact that they mention the Federal Reserve because you don't hear people mention that often. So let's go back into the interview.
Instrument, relatively speaking, and arguably it's just increasing competition. In this case, increasing competition for the scarce resource of money, as opposed to breaking up giant monopolies and increasing competition by having a larger number of small businesses, which arguably could also reduce inflation, correct?
Right, and it could also have, it could be counterproductive. I'll give you an example that's happening right now. As interest rates are going up, so are mortgage rates. In other words, if you want to buy a house or an apartment these days, you're going to have to pay significantly higher interest rates.
Listen to this, you guys. This is actually what I was trying to warn people about when we talk about the housing situation in this country. I've been through 08. I do not want to have to deal with that again, but listen to what he says about the housing situation.
For your mortgage loan than you did 6, 12, or 18 months ago. But here's the irony. Is that slowing down the demand for housing? Not at all. It's having the opposite effect. It's driving the prices up faster. And the explanation is easy. As people are informed by their banker that interest rates are rising because of the federal action, the banker says to the prospective home buyer, you better borrow now, because if you don't, if you wait a few months, you're likely to be facing even higher interest rates. So
does that sound familiar to you? You better go ahead and borrow now. Better go ahead and try to get that house now, because if you wait any longer, the interest rates will be higher. Where have I heard that before? Many of you either heard that yourself or you've heard that from other people. We've been here before. And this is what I was trying to warn people. If you think things are tough now financially, I know the gas prices are high. I know food is expensive. This is nothing. Richard Wolff is going to go into more detail about what is coming for the rest of this year. And this is why I wanted people to I really wanted to talk about this subject tonight. I had like 6 stories I was going to choose from for tonight. But I felt like it was really important to cover this because I'm telling you, I don't think most people are going to be ready for this. So let's go back into the housing issue again. And by the way, I sincerely hope people don't fall for this again. I sincerely hope people don't run out and try to buy these homes because they have these lenders and these real estate people telling them you got to do it now because if you wait any longer, the interest rates are going to be higher. I sincerely hope people don't fall for that again this time. I do not want to see people lose their houses again. We can't go through this again. So here we go.
We get then the peculiarity that the interest rate increase prompts even more spending, driving up prices. In other words, the opposite effect of what raising interest rates were intended to achieve. And that's not a unique thing happening now. That's a constant problem that this whole policy has to face the risk of not working and even making matters worse.
So Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are arguing, among others, that the way to deal with inflation, that some of the inflation we're seeing is just the result of a spike in demand, just like we saw after World War II, where you had food rationing and everything else there for years, and suddenly people could buy things and they rushed into the marketplace. That's happening now post-COVID. But a large part, they're alleging, of this inflation is also caused by the lack of competition, because when Reagan in 1983 told the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice to stop enforcing our nation's antitrust laws, We had this explosion of mergers and acquisitions, the M&A mania, the Michael Milken, the movie Wall Street, you know, greed is good, all this stuff. And that's still with us. And we don't have a single industry in the United States of any consequence any longer that's not dominated by a handful, you know, 2, 3, 4 at the most companies who control well over 80% of the market. So they operate as cartels. So if you could break those companies up.
So let me go ahead and chime in here, because this actually points out what I just mentioned before we started this video. Where's the competition? This is what I was saying about companies like Walmart and Amazon taking everything over. Who can compete with them? Who? How can a local retail store compete with Amazon when they sell clothes now too? How can a local farm stand, a local small grocery store or pharmacy, a mom and pop? Remember, there used to be local pharmacies before there was CVS and Walgreens. There were actual local pharmacies in the community. How can they compete with Amazon and Walmart? They can't. Even if they want to have an online presence, which is pretty much required nowadays. That's pretty much, if you really want to get your products to sell, people want you to have a website. They want you to have social media. You have to have some type of online presence. Well, guess what, guys? All of those platforms cost money. It costs money to create a website. It costs money to advertise on these platforms. So a lot of these mom and pop places, they can't afford that unless they've been in business like 80 plus years and just passed the business down in the family. Most of them, they can't afford that. They just don't have the money. So how are they going to compete with these mega corporations like Amazon and Walmart and CVS and Walgreens? You can't. You can't. And so then what happens? You have a local pharmacy on the corner in a neighborhood. And then guess what? You have a Walgreens that decides, we are going to put a location right here, right across the street from it. I've seen that happen multiple times, by the way. Now, because Walgreens offers more, the customers, and this is where the customers come into play. This is where I kind of put some of the blame on the customers and the consumers. Instead of continuing to go to the mom and pop local pharmacy that they've known for years, they know all the people who work there, they're treated nicely, get great service, they are impressed by the new, shiny local pharmacy right across the street. So they stop going to the mom and pop business and they start going to the Walgreens. They start going to the Walmart. I've seen grocery stores close because the Super Walmart moved down the street, which also sells groceries. This is where, as the consumer, we have to continue to do what we were doing before and support those local businesses. That's how they stay in business. So all the local customers that were used to going to the mom and pop pharmacy, they all now go to the new, shiny, sparkling Walgreens right across the street. And little by little, the mom and pop business starts to lose money. And before you know it, they can no longer pay the rent on the property because they're not making enough money anymore and they have to close. It's a common story and it's a sad story. So let's go back into this. I want you to hear what Richard Wolff says about this.
That would create competition that would be the most effective and most long-term effective solution to the problem of inflation. But and Biden has given lip service to that. But the Fed apparently doesn't agree with this, or the Republicans won't go along with it, or the administration is afraid to take on these giant interests. Whatever the reason may be, that's not happening. And so they're trying to use, instead of using a scalpel, they're using basically a 10-pound sledgehammer.
Well, let me comment a little bit on the many points basically that you're raising. When demand increases, as you put it, after World War II, people should not imagine that that necessarily means prices will go up. When demand increases, think of it this way. If there are more people that are about to come into your store, you have two ways of reacting if you're a business owner or operator. You can say, oh boy, I've got all these people coming in, I'm going to raise the price. Absolutely. Free enterprise allows you to do that. But there's a second option, which is, oh boy, I've got a lot of people coming into the store. I'm going to order more merchandise and sell more of it to these people. I don't have to raise my prices. I will make more profit by moving more merchandise. In our system, we allow private enterprises to make that choice, even though they're a tiny minority, and we, the majority, have to live with whichever choice they made, either the inflation, rising prices, or what we would much prefer, more product, because that would actually mean more jobs, and that would be the much better way to go. If Mr. Biden were serious, if the Democratic Party leadership were serious, they would be intervening to make sure that the response of business to more demand wasn't a rising price, which we don't want, but was a rising flow of goods produced and passed through to the customers who have this greater demand. That's the first.
Did you hear what he just said? If the Biden administration was actually serious about this, about helping the people, they would intervene. Now, they have no problem intervening in other countries, but when it comes to the corporations, they don't want to step in. They don't want to really intervene. They don't want to step in because these corporations, a lot of them, they're their donors. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? How are you going to push back on the same corporations that donated thousands and thousands of dollars to your campaign? And you're trying to run again. This is why we need to get corporate money out of politics. This is just another example. Let's go back in.
Interesting. The second thing is, Tom, let's take a step back. What are we doing in this economic system we're living in? We have just put our people, the vast majority of our fellow Americans, through one of the worst public health disasters in our country's history, through one of the major economic crashes of our capitalist system. That's in 2020 and 2021. Now, in the latter part of 2021 and this first part of 2022, we hit them in the face with an inflation outrunning wages. And now Deutsche Bank, as you rightly foreground, is telling us, oh, wait, we got one more thing to hit you with, a depression or a recession, which is how we're going to deal with the inflation, which is how we dealt with, I mean, this is, you're building, and I say this with all humility, you are building a reservoir of anger and bitterness and, frankly, disappointment in our economic system that ought to have the folks at the top little less eager to squeeze more profit and a little bit more worry that they may be destroying the goose that laid the golden egg for them.
Right.
So he is predicting that we are headed into a recession. Not right now, but the latter part of the year. And this is what I was afraid of. Here we go again. And so I sincerely hope that if that does happen, that is enough fire to really get people out in the streets. I really hope that is enough for people who are on the right, the left, or people who really don't care about politics at all to get out in the streets and raise hell. Because at that point, what do you have to lose? I would not be surprised if this year we're going to see more people lose their homes again. Not because they're being evicted, but because they just can't, they have no money. They have no money. I would not be surprised. And for people who are homeowners, obviously, if you can't afford to pay your mortgage, one of the things you can do is sell your house, correct? How are you going to sell your house if there's no one to buy it? Who's going to buy it besides the people who are already rich and already have multiple homes? I don't think they want to come get my house. My house is small. They're not trying to come here. So then you're going to have all these people with these homes that they can't sell. So where are people going to go? What are people going to do? And this is what I was afraid of. How much longer can people continue to pay these high gas prices? How much longer can people continue to pay the high prices at the grocery store? Do you want to know how much it costs? I shouldn't tell you guys. I'm going to tell you guys. I was trying to make a recipe that my mom makes. Part of that recipe involves steak. $20 for one. I've never paid $20 for one steak. This is not a filet mignon. Just a regular steak at the grocery store. That's where we're at now. And obviously, that's not something I can have all the time, obviously. But what is happening here? When are we going to put some type of pressure on the politicians? Well, on the donors. When are we going to put pressure on these people to actually give us a decent life and a better way of living? When are we going to do it? Because if we go into a recession later this year, like Richard Wolff is predicting here, and Deutsche Bank is predicting as well, if this happens, all the people who are like, vote harder and vote blue no matter who, can fuck off. Because what are you going to say then? What are you going to say come November after midterms and we are into a recession? What at that point has voting done? This is why I really want people to pay close attention to the class issue and the class divide and take less of your focus off of this red versus blue. At the end of the day, neither one of those parties are trying to help people right now. Neither one of them are stepping in. What is happening here? Now, I have another story I'm going to go into after this with Jen Psaki about inflation as well. But what else has to happen, people? What else has to happen to get people out into the street? What more do we need? What more? I'm going to go back in.
Right. So there are a number of tools that could be used. One that I mentioned and I'm enthusiastic about is enforcing our antitrust laws. Another that Bernie is proposing is a windfall profits tax, which, and in order to identify windfall profits, you'd have to identify basically monopolistic behavior, and the withholding of more goods and instead of just raising prices, as you just described. A third would be wage and price controls, which Richard Nixon tried in the 1970s. And my recollection is that it didn't work out that well. What's your preference, or is there a fourth option that I'm missing?
Well, my preference would be a mixture of all of them. I mean, we don't have all that much experience. I was paying close attention back in 1971 when Richard Nixon imposed a wage price freeze. And for a good 8 or 9 months, it did the job. It brought down the inflation in this country from the double digits right down to near zero because it was harsh and it was strictly enforced. Now, many, many interests went to work, Republican, Democrat, and so on, to undo that wage price freeze, to open up the exemptions that had been written into it in the first place so that it could be undone. And they were ultimately successful, which I'm not surprised at. But I wouldn't draw from that it couldn't be done if you had a government really committed to do it. And if you
had a government that was committed to do it. A wage freeze, a price freeze, if you had a government that was committed to doing it. And this is going to go into my point about what Jen Psaki is going to talk about here in a minute. A lot of people are pointing fingers at the corporations, but the government can intervene, and they're not doing so. Let's go back in. This is another point about having a living wage, by the way. People don't have a living wage in this country. Most people don't. People are living paycheck to paycheck. So when hard times hit or the economy is bad, the people in those situations are going to suffer the most. They're going to be hit the hardest. But if we paid people a living wage, if we gave everybody universal health care, by the way, if we go into a recession and you don't have health insurance and you have to go to the doctor, how's that going to turn out? If we gave people these tangibles that we need in this country, we could probably get through this a lot easier. But you can't do that. I know people right now, they're not even doing their foregoing doctor visits, which are important to have, like physicals that you need to have. They're foregoing all of these things that they would usually get because they don't have the money to pay. Because food costs more and gas costs more. So they are faced with, do I pay for my doctor's visit to get an important physical that I need to get? Or do I eat? That's where some people are at right now. Let's go back in. Ozzy said, what's a doctor? Oh, man.
You coupled some wage and price controls with some effort to make sure that the response to extra demand, if it's really there, is more goods production and jobs and not raising prices. I think you could begin to make some real change. And I would advocate also that a real leader, someone who uses the position of the presidency or the dominant political party, that went out into the countryside and said, hey, the most effective, quick way to prevent prices from going up is for people to say, if we see a price increase, we're going to go elsewhere. We're not going to buy those things. You know, the boycott is a powerful weapon, whatever else you might call it. Jawboning from a leader about this would go a long way to start the ball rolling to make a different economy. But again, let me underscore.
We have more power than we realize. He's mentioning boycotts. He's talking about real leaders. If the prices are too high in one place, saying, you know what, I'm not going to pay for this. We have some power there. I wanted you to remember that. Let's go back in.
Even if you would reestablish competition, people have to understand that the way capitalism works, the competitors fight each other. One of them wins, and the loser usually goes bankrupt or fades away, and the workers in the losing enterprise then go and get a job in the one that won. In other words, make a long story short, destroys itself and produces the oligopoly, that's the few big ones, or the monopoly. We've seen this over and over again. It's part of capitalism. So we may congratulate ourselves if we reintroduce some competition. But what we're doing is putting back in place the very system, the structure that brought us.
Tom, your pictures come up too soon at the end. You got to fix that, Tom. I'm just letting Tom know. But what Richard Wolff is saying there, that's incredibly important. That's incredibly important. He's letting you know the government that we have in place, they can actually step in. They're choosing not to. Everybody is pointing fingers at someone else other than themselves. This goes to show you how much they really care about the American people. We had a pandemic. Records of unemployment. I don't care what Joe Biden says about the unemployment number. His number is flawed because he kicked people off of unemployment. Just because you haven't filed for unemployment doesn't mean you're not unemployed. You have all these companies that don't want to pay people a living wage. People can't get health insurance at these companies. People are kicking employees off of health insurance. And then you have employees who are overworked because these companies are so cheap. When people leave the company, instead of replacing those positions, they're choosing to just leave those positions empty and not repost them and take that work and dump it on the employees who are left there. I experienced that myself, so I know what's up. So there's a lot of greed. This is why you're seeing more people go on strike. They don't want to pay these people. They don't want to pay them more. Meanwhile, the CEO is making all the money. They have every right to strike and every right to fight back. I'm going to go to some of these comments and I'm going to chime into the Jen Psaki story, and I have some things to say about that as well. Thank you for the super chat, Don Deering. Amazon is a great distribution model, but it should be owned collectively. The problem isn't large enterprises. The problem is private ownership. That's interesting. Pat said banks loan out money almost free for the rich. The rest of us pay 20% on our credit cards. Oh, that's another thing I'm going to mention too. If we head into that way too as well, people are going to be putting more items, more purchases on their credit cards, which is going to put people further and further in debt. Somniferious says it's hard to talk about inflation without mentioning the Federal Reserve if you're a professor of economics. That's a good point. Leroy says even when people try to compete with Amazon, Amazon will take their intellectual property and release the same product for cheaper. See? Gary said, Sabby, come on now. The consumer can't fight K Street. Actually, that's not 100% true. I can tell you about a couple of towns that have fought against this in Massachusetts. Actually, New England, it's more of a bigger thing I've noticed. Newton actually was propositioned with bringing in a Walmart and a Target, and the people in the town of Newton fought back. So that is why if you go to Newton, Massachusetts, which is just 15 minutes outside of Boston, there's no Target and there's no Walmart. I think Vermont just got their very first Walmart a couple of years ago. They had fought back against that too. So you can fight back against these things, but a lot of times, like, sometimes people don't try. And honestly, and sometimes people are like, well, yay, a Walmart, that's going to be great for me because things are going to be cheaper, not realizing what's happening down the road, right? Laura Hansen said, one of the reasons I enjoy living in a village in northern Thailand is because mom and pop places are very much alive. That's good to know. Sebastian said, Sabby, don't forget about NAFTA and how this terrible trade deal eliminated the working class in the USA. That's true. That's a big part of it as well. Cryptician's in the house and says, if Ajamu Baraka can ever become president, he should make Richard Wolff his head of Treasury Department. That would be interesting, huh? Danielle said, BlackRock will buy it and rent it back to you for more. That's another one. BlackRock, they're another one. They're buying up all this real estate. It's terrible. Cryptician also says, Sabby breaking it down real hard, so there's no way you cannot understand her message and their implications. Oh, thank you, Cryptician. Ilhanner says, this is what our government looks like when we let hedge funds run the government. Creative Experiments, poor Tom Hartman still wishing for the ghost of FDR to save him. Oh, Tom.